What's up, everybody?
Keep forgetting.
Ah, oh,
Keep that in.
No the show goes on. I'm severely injured, but that's how excited I am. Shout out to everybody all around the world doing their thing who doesn't have a knee injury. Shout out to Star Wars Day Eve. My knee really hurts.
Oh yeah. About that.
All right. This is most likely, hopefully, the last review session that I'm doing on content on the history of Europe, because we're going to finish it. And then starting next week, I'm still going to do the review sessions next week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Each one will be on, I probably won't do one Thursday. Well, maybe. Each one will be on kind of like test preparation stuff. How to do, how the exam breaks down, and what are the best practices for the different types of questions. So look out for those. So here we go. World War II ends, obviously, right? What happened? Hitler eats a lead pill and also a poison pill. And then the Nazi party transitions to other leadership, but ultimately they're going to surrender, which leaves the war in the Pacific still going on. The Japanese not as inclined to surrender. We have a couple of major battles that are extremely costly on both sides. The main one being Okinawa, which is the bloodiest battle in all of World War II. A lot of people think it's D-Day. It's actually Okinawa is substantially more horrendous, I guess, in terms of cost and the combat. That is part of the reason for that is it's getting towards the end of the war. The Japanese know that we're pushing in. It's also Okinawa is significant because it is the first and really last battle that's on actual Japanese soil. Okay. The island of Okinawa is considered to be Japanese soil, whereas up to that point, when we're doing the island hopping, those are territories that the Japanese had either taken during the war or kind of wanted. So when we get to Okinawa, it's actually Japanese soil, and the Japanese fight literally, they're going to fight to the last man. And that's significant because it gives us, the Allies, the understanding that the Japanese are not going to surrender like the Germans did, that there's not going to be any kind of conditional surrender, that they're going to fight until the very end. And, obviously when the war ends in the Atlantic, people are kind of even more done with the war, right? There's even more of a desire to see it end because we had a little taste of it. So we really want the war to end. We don't want to spend the same amount of money and lives that we did fighting basically the whole first part of the war just on the Pacific. And again, the Japanese are showing no signs that they're going to surrender despite the defeats that they're taking. The United States and the Allies start just heavily bombarding Japan, firebombing them relentlessly, and again, still not surrendering. A lot of people most Americans, most people in the modern world today are very much aware of the fact that we dropped atomic bombs. What a lot of people don't realize is prior to the use of the atomic weapons, like I just said, we were dropping significant ordnance on Japan, and not just military targets. I mean, we were just bombing Japan relentlessly for an extended period of time, firebombing them, just dropping hundreds and thousands of pounds of explosive munitions on the Japanese. And again, showing no signs of surrender. So it's at that point that the United States really specifically gets to the conclusion that, we really don't want to do this invasion. If we do, it's going to be extremely costly in terms of life, not just for the Allies, but for the Japanese too. And so the decision is made to use a new weapon, the atomic bomb, which had been tested, but we're still not sure it's going to work. We drop one on Hiroshima. Which one's first? Hiroshima's first. Drop one on Hiroshima, and the Japanese still don't surrender. And so after that, we drop one on Nagasaki, and at that point, the Japanese Empire does surrender, ending the war completely. There are some important things that relate into the post-war world at the end of World War II. First, obviously the use of the atomic bomb. it shows the world that the United States has atomic weapons, which no one else at that point does, which instantly propels the United States to the position of the #1 superpower because we have the ultimate weapon. The other thing that's significant about this is the alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union, or the Western allies in the Soviet Union, was never really strong. Although what made it work for a lot of the war was the relationship between Joseph Stalin and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States. FDR was a master politician, and he was excellent at getting people to do basically what he wanted them to do. But he was a great uniter of people, and just an excellent, just a people person. And he had a really strong relationship with Joseph Stalin. Very few people, if any, had any kind of relationship with Joseph Stalin. The fact that FDR was able to cultivate an alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union for the bulk of the war is pretty unbelievable. And a big part of it was FDR, again, the personal relationship with Stalin, but also, and the fact that Stalin kind of respected him, but also the fact that FDR, the way he dealt with Stalin and the way that he dealt with the Soviet Union, he treated them as equals. He didn't work with them from a position of solely like force and power. And, you know, when he made promises to Stalin and the Soviet Union, he made sure that he kept them. And so Stalin had respect for him. If FDR doesn't die, there's a chance the Cold War doesn't happen, or at least it doesn't happen right away. Unfortunately, he does die prior to the end of the war, and his vice president takes over, Harry Truman. And Truman has a completely different approach to pretty much everything, but definitely to the Soviet Union and to his allies. It is a more adversarial relationship, and one based on distrust and force and control and dominance. And so pretty much right away, when Truman takes over, the Cold War is going to technically begin, because that distrust and that tension is really going to increase. So after, and the other thing is, the Soviet Union had promised to join, the focus between the Allies was always ending the war in Europe first, because if we had focused on the Pacific, where there wasn't a direct threat to our allied nations, and the Soviet Union and or Great Britain had been knocked out of the war, we would have been the only ones left. So it was really at the beginning of America's involvement in the war, there is this agreement between Stalin and Churchill that the focus of the war will be on the Atlantic first. And the second part to that agreement is that the Soviet Union and Great Britain will help America defeat the Japanese in the Pacific once the war in Europe is either over or kind of under control. Again, with FDR's passing, one of the things that also kind of pushes this thing into a confrontation is the fact that the Soviet Union really, when the war in Europe ends, they show no interest in and no real signs that they're going to live up to that promise, right? And part of that's, would they have done it if the FDR's still alive and still president? I think yes, but who knows? They weren't really in a position to help, to be honest. They were pretty badly beat up. But the war ends, and so the question quickly becomes, what are we going to do with this post-war world? And one of the first things that one of the first approaches to post-World War II Europe is what's called the Marshall Plan. And this is a pretty significant plan and policy for a couple of reasons. One, it's one of the great moments in history where people actually learn from history, right? It's evident that people study history and how important studying history is, so you don't make the same mistakes. And the Marshall Plan is heavily based off of basically how we got to World War II from World War I. And if we think back to the interwar period, one of the things that led to World War II, besides the fact, was how poorly, right, the countries that won World War I handled the post-World War I world, specifically Europe. And we wanted to punish those that lost, and we kind of left Europe, the Allies, just to its own devices. And what we saw there is, when you leave new countries that are created post-war, or countries that are devastated by war, when you kind of leave them to figure things out for their own, and you don't provide assistance, that usually, things get bad economically, politically, they're unstable, and that lends itself to an open door for negative consequences, and those countries going in a direction politically, governmentally, that wouldn't be ideal for the post-war world. And so that's what the Marshall Plan is really designed to do. All right. The thought is that we want a lot of Europe and the world that's now in flux as at the result of World War II. We want them to become democracies or self-determined, but we want them to be strong economically and politically so they don't fall under Soviet control. And so the Marshall Plan is basically a blank check to any of the countries in Europe that aren't under Soviet control or who need it, that we will give them money to rebuild their infrastructure and to basically put them in a position economically where they're powerful and they're doing well, so they don't turn to communism, right? Or some other form of totalitarian government that's not ideal. So it's avoiding future conflict with the understanding that the best way to do that is to put everyone in a pretty good situation. And so we're going to spend, we being the United States, about $13 billion on economic recovery. Again, offered mainly to Western democracies. We do not give any of that money to Eastern European nations that are in the sphere of control of the Soviet Union. So the United States and the West's approach to the post-war world is going to be rebuilding, and at this point in the early stages, it's kind of indirect, but not allowing the spread of communism, right? And that's part of what will become the Truman Doctrine, which will be focused on containing the Soviet Union where it exists, not letting it spread. So one of the other nice thing about the Marshall Plan is that it works, right? And which is kind of rare in history. It's one of the few plans that, when implemented, it's very successful. And so the Marshall Plan, the spreading of this money, not only does it help these countries rebuild, but what's particularly interesting is how it's not just that it's successful, how successful it is. And the Marshall Plan is going to create an economic boom in the countries that participate in it. Several of the countries that participate in the Marshall Plan are actually going to be better off economically, stronger economically than they were before the war started. For example, in West Germany, the gross national product is going to be 15 to 20% higher in the post-war years than it was in the pre-war years. And so this whole thing is called the economic miracle. The fact that the Marshall Plan works and works so well that it's going to turn these countries around pretty rapidly economically and create stability among them, to the extent that it does, right? One of the things that happens as a result of the Marshall Plan is not just that these countries thrive economically, but it's going to spread the economic practice of consumerism throughout Europe, which is going to be a new concept to some of Europe, right? Their economies are going to quickly become based around consumerism, buying things, right? The acquisition of goods on sale in a market, meaning that people are buying things not just for necessity, but out of desire, right? Buying things that they want, not necessarily just things that they need. And so this is part of what sets the groundwork for the tension and disconnect between the Western part of Europe, or the Western world, and the Soviet world, right? It's this prosperity and this economic boom, right? Because the Western countries that can get involved in the Marshall Plan, they're going to prosper economically to an extremely high degree. And, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you want to look at it, the countries that fall under Soviet control are not only not going to prosper as much, but they're actually, some of them are going to go the opposite way, or they're going to become stagnant economically. They're going to go backwards economically. It's going to be a bad situation for them. So that is part of that is an important concept to understand, the disparity in economic prosperity between the East and the West of Europe, the Soviet and the Western world during the Cold War, because it's part of the story and it's part of how the Cold War ends. So where does the Cold War start? Okay, at the end of World War II, right? It's a a Cold War, right? This is the Cold War, but any war could technically be cold. The difference between a Cold War and a hot war is direct military engagement. A Cold War is a conflict between belligerent nations that never enter into direct military contact, right? The second they do, it becomes hot, all right? It's a long-standing tension that never really leads to direct war, okay? The reason for the Cold War, right? We talked about the economic prosperity issue. The other reasons are the way that the two groups are looking at the post-war world. The West, with the United States being the superpower in the West, their focus is not having another World War III and kind of trying to, in doing that, right, spreading economic prosperity, democracy, and capitalism throughout the world, right? That's the West is under the impression that that's the best way to avoid another world is get as many countries in the world as possible to be democratic, right? To be capitalist and to be doing well economically, right? So that's their focus. They don't want another world war. They don't want any kind of conflicting political ideology to spread across the globe like Nazism or Imperial Japan. Fascism in general. Now, on the flip side, the Soviet Union looks at the post-World War II world from a personal perspective. This is now the second World War that they've kind of gotten beat up, right? And this one in particular is pretty horrific. They do the bulk of the fighting in the European theater, and they lose an astronomical amount of people, right? The Soviet Union is going to lose in the tens of millions of people in World War II. And to put that into perspective, the United States loses less than 1 million people in combat. So, and our country's untouched infrastructure wise, right? So it's not the same experience, right? Their main focus is protecting themselves from future aggression, right? So their main priority is no one ever gets in Russia again, and we will kind of do what we need to do to protect ourselves and to finally be prosperous as a nation. And if that means having to conquer all of Europe so that no one can invade us, then that's what we'll do. So that's their main priority: safety and prosperity, the Soviet Union, right? So right there, we're in conflict, right? And if we go even deeper than that, the other reason for the Cold War is the fact that not the Western world, right? They're primarily democracies, right? And they're focused around democratic principles and capitalist economies. Whereas in the Soviet Union, right, they're focused on a more totalitarian regime governmentally, but really about communism, right? And so that at the seed of this is also what leads to the conflict, because these two groups, these two entities, their ideologies at a foundational philosophical level are not only different, but they're in direct opposition of each other, right? Yin and yang. And so they're kind of set up for conflict, even in spite of all the other stuff that we've talked about that just pushes it closer and closer. Ideologically, they're opposed, right? So how does this thing start to play out? Well, at the very beginning, one of the issues that comes about is the various countries in Europe that were under Nazi control, were under Italian control, whatever. What are they going to do? What are we going to do with them now? The West wants them to self-determine. Basically, FDR and Stalin had an agreement that at the end of the war, whoever was left as a new nation would be able to hold free and fair elections and decide for themselves what they want to be. And pretty much right away, the Soviet Union kind of goes back on their word and starts influencing or annexing some of these new countries. Again, their focus is protection. And so they want to create a buffer zone around Russia proper to insulate themselves from the rest of Europe so that a Germany can never, invade them again, or France or whoever, right? And so that's their focus. The United States sees this as a violation of the agreement and an effort to suppress the spread of freedom and democracy and capitalism throughout Europe, right? So both of us are going to be like approaching this from the perspective of containing the other, all right? This plays out in a big way in Germany. So in Germany, right at the end of the war, there are 4 zones for each of the allies, right? With the understanding that that's a short-term position and that all 4 of the allies are supposed to leave Germany and allow Germany to, again, self-determine and kind of rebuild itself as a democracy. So at the immediately after the war, we have a French zone, a British zone, an American zone, and a Soviet zone. Now, the Western allies, as agreed upon, they kind of leave Germany to itself, but the Soviet Union stays, and that instantly creates a divide in Germany between a Soviet side in the east and a Western side under, U.S. Western power guidance, we'll say. And because the eastern side stays under the control of the Soviet Union and they don't leave, we, the West, start pumping money into the Western part as part of the Marshall Plan. And so what happens pretty quickly is that the Western part of Germany starts to rebuild, starts to thrive and prosper economically, whereas the Eastern part does not, because their focus is basically suppression, the Soviet Union. And so this is eventually going to lead to the Berlin Wall, because what the Soviets see is as things get better in the West, a lot of East Germans start just leaving Eastern Germany, moving to Western Germany because things are going well there. That doesn't look good for communism. As a general rule of thumb, you weren't allowed to leave a country if you were in the Soviet Union, right? So they're going to put up a wall and basically stop people from being able to leave East Germany. But we'll talk more about that in a second. The next thing that happens that kind of furthers the ball down the road is what's called the Iron Curtain speech. Shortly after World War II, Winston Churchill is going to give a speech in which he's going to coin the phrase, the Iron Curtain. He's going to start to use some of the terminology and vocabulary that he had used when describing Nazism in Germany to describe the Soviet Union. And so he's going to talk about how the Soviet Union is spreading this iron curtain, right, across Europe, and, spreading their communism and kind of how they are a threat to Western democracy. And so that is really a pivotal moment, because he says that Churchill says the quiet part out loud. People start to view the Soviet Union as a threat to the West. He establishes that, and then obviously again coins the phrase the Iron Curtain. The next thing that happens pretty much right away is both sides instantly start building up arms for this next world war, right? They're both convinced that it's just a matter of time before we fight each other. We're the 2 big superpowers. It's going to be another world war with the Soviet Union and all its allies, and the Soviet Union and the United States with their Western allies. And so this massive arms buildup begins. A lot of it's centered around nuclear weapons. Pretty rapidly, the United States is going to build the hydrogen bomb, which they theoretically had the ability to do even when they were building the atomic bomb, but they thought it was too powerful. Truman's going to go back on that and approve the building of the hydrogen bomb. And shortly after the United States has the hydrogen bomb, Soviet Union's going to build their own version and test it. And at that point, everyone's going to freak out, because now everyone knows these are the 2 biggest kids on the block, and they're waiting for them to start fighting. And now they both have nuclear weapons. So now it's even more likely that we're going to have a conflict, because one of the things that was keeping the Cold War kind of cold was the fact that only one of us had atomic weapons, but now we both do. So there's no imbalance, right? So we're going to go through this big arms race, and it's significant, right? It's important to remember this lasts a really long time. The United States and the Soviet Union are going to be building munitions for this war that never comes for generations of a huge amount of treasure and focus being in, military buildup and arms and munitions development. And again, as we know from World War I, when countries are building arms and weapons, it just leads them closer to that conflict. We also get a culture war. Both sides are going to use try and influence the other, or influence independent nations to their side through the projection of their culture as superior, but also the diminishing viewpoint of the opposite culture, right? The use of propaganda. The West is going to be significantly more successful than the Soviet Union in winning the culture war for a number of reasons, which we'll talk about. At the beginning, some examples: Radio Free Europe, which is a radio broadcast network centered around the creation and spread of entertainment focused on messaging the benefits of democracy. Obviously, the Soviet Union is going to respond with their own focus on the ills of capitalism and the racist policies of the United States, pointing out the hypocrisy of the United States. Hey, they're so focused on capitalism and freedom, but they're racist and civil rights and all this. We'll come back to the culture war when we get to some of the technological advances later on. The other important thing is, though the Cold War never goes hot in a direct conflict between the two entities, there are what's called proxy wars, a number of instances where the two are going to essentially fight each other indirectly through the use of subordinate nations, right? And that's what a proxy war is. The two big proxy wars during the Cold War are the Korean War. Korean War is Korea. The country of Korea was a colony of Japan. So when Japan loses the war, it's stripped from them. What are we going to do with Korea? The communists, the Soviet communists, are going to try and push Korea towards joining the Soviet Union. And that's going to push down from the north through China. So China is going to send soldiers and try and influence Korea to be communist. The West is going to come up from the South. So at a certain point, we're both kind of supporting, just like in Germany, half and half, right? And eventually that's going to lead to an actual war. It's a civil war, but it's really a war between communism and the West, right? Because yes, North Koreans who want to be communist are fighting South Koreans who don't, but Chinese communists are sending soldiers in to facilitate the forces in the North, and then eventually the United States will send U.S. troops into the southern part, and that will be the Korean War. Fun fact, the Korean War never officially ends. We sign an armistice, which basically puts the war on pause, but it never officially ends, which is why today, to this day, North and South Korea are still separated. And then, of course, we get later on the Vietnam War. Again, very similar situation here. Southeast Asian country divided between North and South, split along the lines of communism and democracy. China being influential, the Soviet Union being influential in the North, the United States and some other Western powers being influential in the South. And that's going to, again, lead to a kind of an internal civil war conflict, which the United States will contribute directly troops to. It's a 20-year conflict that costs millions of dollars and millions of lives, right? So those are the proxy wars in the Cold War. What influence does the United States have on Europe during the Cold War? Well, there's a multitude of things. First, there's two big ones. First, the creation of a world monetary trade system. We're going to get International Monetary Fund, which offers loans to nations struggling to rebuild. And then the second thing is we're going to create what's called NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is a military pact created for the defense of the Western European nations. So we're going to basically build a system of alliances. Again, following in the footsteps of what caused World War II, which caused World War I, and lead up to these massive military alliances where we're not learning from all of our mistakes in the past. Now, the Soviet Union is also going to have a significant influence on Europe during the Cold War. They're going to spread a number of countries. They're going to spread the Soviet Union to a number of countries and make them directly part of the Soviet Union. One of the things that's instantly different about the effect that Soviet Union has on Europe as opposed to the United States or the West is when the Soviet Union spreads Soviet communism to a country, right? They come under the direct control of the Soviet Union, of the Soviet political party, right? Direct control. When the West or the United States spreads democracy, we don't have direct control over them. They're a free, independent nation, right? We don't control their economic production. We don't control their military assets, right? Whereas the Soviet Union does when they spread communism or enter a country into the Soviet Union. So first tier is countries that actually become part of the Soviet Union. The second tier is there are also countries that are not necessarily part of the Soviet Union, but they're in what's called the Soviet bloc, right, or the Iron Curtain. These are countries that are under Soviet kind of indirect control and protection, but they're not exactly officially parts of the Soviet Union, right? Now, the significant thing for this is if you're in the Soviet bloc or the Soviet Union, you fall under what's called central planning in the Soviet Union, which means Soviet Union, the Soviet government has complete control over you. They tell you what your state's economy is going to be, what it's going to be focused on producing, and how much of it can produce, what you can import and what you export. So your economic control as a country is not centered around what's best for your country or your people. It's focused around what's best for the Soviet Union. And oftentimes that means it's probably not what's best for your people or your country. So the Soviet response to the Marshall Plan, the World Bank, et cetera, is what's called the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, or Comecon. Okay, and the Soviet Union's response to NATO is what's called the Warsaw Pact, which is a military alliance with all the satellite nations of the Soviet Union. So again, we've drawn a hard line between Europe, right? Pretty much everyone's on either the Soviet side or the Western US side. Okay. Other things that influence Europe under the Soviet Union's dominance of the eastern part of Europe. The first thing that we get is Stalin's 5-year plans. He initially institutes a 5-year plan. It doesn't go real well. He tries to pivot and kind of tweak it. They're both unsuccessful. His 5-year plans were designed to, again, spread communism, spread the Soviet Union throughout Europe, create that kind of barrier buffer zone, but also to build up and industrialize and modernize the Soviet Union by kind of sprinkling in little bits of capitalism and industrialization, kind of going off the communist book, so to speak. Neither of those two plans is successful. And in fact, oftentimes cause more damage than they resolve. I'm going to pause there for a second. About that, folks. Technical difficulties there. So another impact that the Soviet Union had on Europe was the institution of social welfare programs. Okay. One of the things that's at the heart of communism is this concept of the redistribution of wealth, and the focus being on the working class or the lower classes. And so the Soviet Union is going to institute a number of social welfare programs, most of which are not very effective. And this is kind of, the story of the Soviet Union is, in theory and in principle, they're going to do things, but in practice, they're going to be failures, right? So the Soviet Union is going to institute some welfare programs that are going to have minimal success, okay, due to poor execution, poor infrastructure, and corruption, right? So, for example, one of the things that they're going to institute is universal housing, right? Great concept, right? Everyone should have a house. But again, multiple families living in very small, very cramped, and without any amenities, right? That type of apartment. The Soviet Union is also going to rule over its people with an iron fist. There's going to be a reduction in civil liberties and freedoms, right? They're all about control. That's what keeps the Soviet Union whole and moving forward. In fact, as we see, that towards the end, when the Soviet Union starts to wheel back its control and power over people, that's when the Union is going to start to dissolve and fall apart. We mentioned the Berlin Wall earlier. At first, it's kind of a red line, and as more and more East Germans are ignoring it and moving to the West because they're the prosperity. Eventually, they're going to build a physical wall with barbed wire at the top, and try and prevent the mixing of ideology, of culture, and certainly people moving from one side to the other. It's going to remain in place until 1991. Now, where the Soviet Union in the Cold War really takes a dramatic turn is with the death of Joseph Stalin, right? With many of these empires, as we've seen throughout European history, we'll say, that are built around kind of control and an ideology, and where the people don't have a lot of input in government. The ones that are successful initially, a lot of times it has to do with the cult of personality or the control that one individual has, and when that individual is replaced, a lot of times they either fall apart right away or at the beginning of the end. And that's certainly true with the Soviet Union. The problems really start to compound with the death of Stalin. Right now, he's going to be in control of Soviet Union for a long time. Right, he dies, I believe, in his 70s. I think of a heart attack, if I remember correctly. But when he dies, we're going to go through a series of Soviet leaders. Each one's going to try and restore or preserve the Soviet Union. And for pretty much all of them, the things that they do to either re-energize, rebuild, or kind of hold on are oftentimes going to make things, again, even worse. The first big Soviet leader post-Stalin is Nikita Khrushchev. Now, he knows that the Soviet Union's in a period of rapid decline, and so he's going to try and implement a number of policies, again, to hold the Soviet Union together and to re-strengthen it. These policies are often referred to as what's called de-Stalinization. So we're kind of going to try and go in the opposite direction of Stalin, right? That's Khrushchev believes, hey, we need to compete with the West, and so we're going to try and people don't like some of the policies of Stalin. So to get them to kind of stay and not leave, we're going to go in the opposite direction. That's what we're going to tell people. And so the first thing he's going to do is release a lot of people that were put in the Russian prisons and kind of excommunicated or disappeared by the Russian secret police under Stalin. We're going to release them, opponents. He's also going to try and implement a number of economic reforms. He's going to create a standard 40-hour work week, stuff that the West had done generations prior, right? That Russia's or the Soviet Union is just way behind on. Standard 40-hour work week, the production of manufactured goods to improve the Soviet people's quality of life, right? Some amenities, some a little bit of consumerism. He's also going to offer the satellite states of the Soviet Union more economic and civil freedoms. Again, ultimately, this is too little too late. And it also leads to a lot of those satellite countries or even countries within the Soviet Union kind of turning away from Soviet communism. Turns out when you give the people what they want, which is more freedom, they tend to use that freedom to try and get out away from the Soviet Union. And that's where some of the internal revolts begin. Due to the failing economic situation inside the Soviet bloc, a lot of countries are continuously looking for ways out. A good example of this is the Hungarian Revolution, where we have Hungarian leadership that is focused around having free and fair elections, even though some of the people that are going to be pushing for this kind of free election in Hungary are communists, right? But Soviet communism is so bad for their country and their people that they want to get away from it. They're not allowed, they're not permitted to do that. They're going to rise up in rebellion. In response, the Soviet Union is going to send in the Red Army. So thousands of people are going to be killed, and they're going to crush the rebellion. And this is the first time that these internal rebellions, right? This is an example of some of the first internal rebellions. And what we see is not only that there's starting to be a crack in Soviet Union and their control, but that they will respond with force and suppress, right? Then we get the revolutions of 1989. The new leader, Khrushchev, announced in 1989 that the Soviet Union will no longer intervene militarily in conflicts involving states of the Soviet bloc. And so in response, many of the states in the Soviet bloc began instituting reforms they had been seeking for years, but now there's no Soviet response to stop them. Again, this is where we get into the fall of the Soviet Union. So what are some of the problems? A bunch of things, right? And we've talked about a lot of them, but they start to pick up speed and compound. One of the first issues is that the Soviet Union is a centralized economy. And to make such an economy run, they rely on this massive bureaucracy, which oftentimes breeds inefficiency and corruption, okay? The other thing is more ideological or fundamental, which is, part of Soviet communism is kind of in direct opposition to what the foundations of the Western economies are that make them so prosperous, and also kind of opposed to human nature in a sense. For example, in the Soviet Union, you're guaranteed a job, which is great. But when you're guaranteed a job, how hard are a lot of people going to work to get a job? The other thing is they don't really have a lot of choice over what their job is. So people aren't passionate about it. There's not a lot of innovation. There's not a lot of invention. There's not a lot of pushing, and therefore not a lot of prosperity. Additionally, on top of this, as it always seemed to be the case, we have an agricultural issue that just further compounds things. There's a poor grain harvest and that plagued Russia or the Soviet Union at the time. Now, after Khrushchev, we get Mikhail Gorbachev, who is the next big leader of the Soviet Union. And again, he's going to try and implement reforms because he's coming in again at the end of the party. Gorbachev is the most Western-friendly Soviet leader at this point in the story. He's going to try and implement two general policies. The first one's focused on the restructuring of the Soviet economy by introducing some limited free market elements like the concept of private property. He's also going to institute policies that are focused around the concept of the Soviet government being more open and transparent, right? Telling the countries in the Soviet bloc they're not going to intervene directly and militarily if they decide to have an issue. They're going to release more people from prison, and they're going to roll back the secret police. These reforms are absolutely catastrophic for the Soviet Union. As we mentioned, turns out when you give countries under Soviet influence and control more freedom, they use those freedoms to get out. And so ultimately, Gorbachev is going to have to spin back up a lot of the policies that he implements or roll back out a lot of the policies that he kind of cancels to kind of regain control, because the second he pulls back, everyone starts to run away. So he's got to throttle back up to kind of keep the Soviet Union from collapsing. We have the Polish elections of 1989. The Poles were never really big on Soviet rule. By 1989, a political party in Poland known as the Solidarity Party develops with the goal of being to win elections in Poland over Soviet candidates. Gorbachev's going to allow this with the belief that, you know, it will give the people a feeling of control and democracy, but there's no way that their candidates are going to beat Soviet candidates. Turns out he's way off base, and Poland elects all non-Soviet candidates in their elected offices, and therefore they now have the position. They're now in the position, and with the goal being to get out of the Soviet Union. The moment that really marks the fall of the Soviet Union is the fall of the Berlin Wall. By 1989, there are so many East Germans that are fleeing to West Germany that the Soviet government kind of is really struggling to maintain control. And so at a certain point, they just kind of abandon the whole situation. The wall is opened or kind of shut down as far as they're concerned. And almost instantly, people start climbing on the Berlin Wall to tear it down. And at that point, both sides of Germany unite, Germany unifies, and Soviet control, Soviet communism, Germany is pretty much done. So the fall of the Berlin Wall is really a symbol of the fall of the Soviet Union and of communism. We get a number of countries at this time that are departing from the Soviet bloc. Czechoslovakia separates into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Yugoslavia is going to break up into several independent ethnic nations. Now, that's going to bring us into a new period of European history. So we're now out of the Cold War, and it's now Cold War to kind of today. And this period of history is broken up into a couple different topics. The first one is an increase in nationalism and, unfortunately, atrocities. The first example of this is what happens in Chechnya. In the post-World War II era, nationalist separatist movements sweep through Europe, resulting in the formation of new states and ethnic atrocities. The Chechen nationalist movement is an example of this. Many Chechen people in the southernmost part of Russia begin to spread anti-Russian sentiments, seeking separation from Russia. When the USSR falls, Chechnya declares itself independent, which lasts for about 3 years until 1994, when the Russian government decides to reassert its control over the region. This causes years of violent conflict between the two sides, which doesn't end until 2017 with a Russian victory. We also get the Basque separatist movement is another example of this. The Basque group is about 2 million ethnic people who had anti-Spanish sentiments for generations. Then they have been hyper-focused on getting independence from Spain. The ATA is the group that forms in 1959, which is a violent wing of the Basque separatist movement that committed acts of violence and terrorism to draw attention to their cause. Ultimately, the ETA is unsuccessful and eventually would disband. And then this brings us to, kind of the ethnic atrocity part, which is ethnic cleansing, which unfortunately happens post-Cold War in Europe. Again, a lot of this is the instability of the fall of the Soviet Union. Yugoslavia is a nation that is drawn up after World War I, and it combines several different ethnic groups under one nation. And these folks didn't necessarily like or want to be around each other, but we made a country and said, you're all living together. Now, the reason why it's not an issue until after the Cold War is for the majority of the time that Yugoslavia exists, they have a very powerful ruler who rules with an iron fist. And his name's Josip Tito. And so he's going to basically keep everything kind of even keel amongst these groups through, total and brutal control. Once he dies, a guy by the name of Slobodan Milosevic takes over, and he's trying to control the state. There's some, different groups that are jockeying for control. Nobody really gets along. And he decides that in the name of protecting the Serbian minority, he's going to send Serbian troops into Bosnia and carry out ethnic cleansing to eliminate the Muslims, which is a form of genocide, right? Ethnic cleansing is a genocide focused around ethnicity. In 1995, the atrocity had gotten so significant and so much attention that NATO is actually going to intervene to stop it, which they do. Unfortunately, by that point, over 300,000 people had been killed. So that is, an example of the use of NATO, but also of, obviously ethnic cleansing and kind of a result of the fall of the Soviet Union. It's not all good, right? Instability breeds chaos. That brings us to the next kind of topic or segment, which is the European Union. The European Union develops post-World War II. Europe is obviously a continent of entirely separate nations, and that creates barriers to economic prosperity and also, potential conflict. And so there are groups that kind of quickly see, hey, isn't it in the best interest of everyone to have a more united front and more common connections? The group that is at kind of the forefront of the European Union is a group called the Christian Democrats, which is a political movement that rises in Europe focused around a more politically centrist approach to growing separatist movements. So it's middle of the road. It's not either side. It's that we should all kind of just live in the gray to avoid conflict and so that we can all prosper economically. While the political unity of European nations was difficult to establish, a push for economic unity came easier. So the European Union starts as an economic collaboration, right? Everybody wants to make money. And the precursor to the European Union is what's called the European Coal and Steel Company, which is an agreement between six states in Europe to unify the coal and steel production of Europe. This would be the foundation of what would become the European Union and was based on the idea that if these nations were economically tied together, it would be possible for them to go to war with one another. Because this works so well in the six nations, it would later involve a similar agreement around the unification of production of other manufactured goods that would become known as the common market. So it's European Coal and Steel Community, Common Market, European Union, okay? Over the 20th century, more nations would join Common Market. In 1993, Common Market would be renamed the European Union. The European Union is an economic and political unification agreement for Europe. It established 7 bodies that would make policy for the EU member nations. This would be Parliament, the executive body, and a group of ministers who consider issues like defense and foreign policy. The EU is continuously trying to balance questions of national sovereignty with the responsibilities in an economic and political union. So that's the challenge with the European Union. It's similar to the United States in that we have a collection of 50 states working together in one federal union. The difference is in Europe, though they have all those independent states trying to work together, they have a rich history of, being sovereign nations. There's also significantly more barriers and less commonality as far as ethnicity, culture, religion, language, all this. Part of one of the things that we get as a result of the European Union is the euro, which is a standard form of currency for all Europeans established by the European Union, thus increasing the ease of commerce and business and things like this. Another important concept under the kind of banner of the European Union is what's called Brexit. In 2016, the people of Great Britain vote to leave the EU due to issues of immigration, resulting in the official departure in 2020. So the vote is in 2016, which leaving the EU wins the day, but it's not an immediate departure, and that doesn't happen until much later. And that's why Great Britain is not a part of the EU today. Some other things that are important when we talk about the post-Cold War world of Europe or post-Cold War Europe is the development of what's called the welfare state. The welfare state has its roots in Bismarck's Germany. So we're going all the way back pre-World War I. He was one of the first European leaders to institute practices like this. For example, he instituted insurance for those who get hurt while working, old age pensions for those who are too old to work. And then from there, Great Britain's going to pick it up post-World War II. They're going to create programs like low-cost or no-cost universities. They're going to have a standardized health care system, and they're going to have unemployment programs. These policies were initiated by liberal labor parties throughout Europe, but specifically Great Britain, which were seeking to implement a cradle-to-grave social welfare system. That's an important term, cradle-to-grave. That means that they believe that it's the state or the government's job to take care of its citizens from birth until death, right? These welfare programs throughout Europe were funded by increases in taxes, which are mostly widely supported so long as the economies of those nations are thriving. So people are willing to pay high taxes for government programs when they're doing well financially. When they're not doing well financially and the economy is not doing good, the support for high taxes to facilitate this often decreases. The welfare programs throughout Europe were funded by increased taxes. Oh, we said that. However, these once recession hits, and there are two, one in the 70s and one in the 70s and the 80s, tax revenue decreases in places like Great Britain, and so that these social welfare programs become hard to maintain. Margaret Thatcher, who's a very important person in the modern Europe story, because she is both the first female prime minister in Great Britain, but also she's a part of a conservative government, and she is going to cut a significant amount of welfare spending to kind of reel in, lower the taxes and reel in government spending. Another important topic in modern Europe is what's called globalization. This is the increasing economic, political, and social interconnectedness of the world. Globalization has been developing in Europe as early as the age of exploration. During the post-World War II period in Europe, the rate at which globalization is taking place increases and spreads dramatically. A lot of that has to do with the end of World War II and the Marshall Plan and things like this, and kind of the spreading of culture. And a lot of it has to do with technology, which brings us right to our next point, which is innovations in digital technology. As digital technology develops, allowing for a streamlining of communication and instant communication, and we get things like the internet and the computer, it's going to further exacerbate the process of globalization. As the world becomes smaller through digital technology, we become more interconnected. Another thing that leads towards globalization is inventions in entertainment and communication, like movies and television. That not only increases globalization, but it spreads American culture throughout the world. Okay. We also get the development of green parties at this time. This is where the idea of, climate change, deforestation, pollution, basically concern about our environmental situation in this on the planet begins to develop. And political parties form with that being their focus. And they're really responding to consumerism, which has dominated at this point European economies, and how consumerism and globalization are basically having negative outcomes for our environment. We also get mass advances in medicine and medical technology, right? With things like antibiotics and chemotherapy, people are going to live a lot longer than they were in prior periods of European history. Additionally, there are some pushbacks on these advances in technology. It's not a wholesale celebration because of some of the ethical, moral, and religious questions that develop as a result of them. Things like, for example, abortion and birth control pill. They have significant societal impact on, for example, women's lives, women's rights, the economies, and society. They have significant changes economically and socially, but they have opposition also, especially initially, regarding questions of ethics and the religious component. Another thing that happens as a result, or in combination with globalization, kind of the end of World War I, is massive migration and immigration. And it's not something that is wholesale opposed by a lot of European nations. Immediately after World War II, a lot of European nations needs to replace the workforce that they lost due to combat in the war. Additionally, many people in parts of the continent have had their home country, maybe their personal house, destroyed. And so they're in search of economic opportunity. And so additionally, with the process of decolonization throughout Europe also leads to an increase in migration to urban cities. This influx of immigrants was initially economically beneficial for many European nations, but as the economic downturn starts to spread across Europe, the increase in population and existing push for social welfare programs puts supporting these people on the shoulder of the state. As the economy soared, right-wing politicians like the National Front in France led to a surge in anti-immigration sentiment. We also get some massive changes in feminism. There are two waves of feminism. The first wave is during World War II, where the role of women in society changed in varying ways depending on which state we're talking about. In some countries, but generally it's a massive step forward in women's rights, and that's because women are become depended upon during the war to serve in a variety of roles depending on where we're talking about. In some countries, women are fighting on the front line, and so when the war's over, they're going to have a justification for an increased role and rights in society. In other countries, they're still going to push for an increase in their rights and power because they contributed maybe in the war effort or in the workplace to the state's ability to fight the war. The second wave of feminism, the main push during the first wave was to secure the right to vote. The second wave is focused on societal issues such as inequities that women face, including in education, marriage, the law, and professional careers. An advancement in medical technology led to an increase in feminism called the birth control pill, which allowed women to control pregnancy and thus better control their future. During this time, women also began running for elected office throughout Europe. This includes Margaret Thatcher, Great Britain's first prime minister, Mary Robinson, Ireland's first female president, and Edith Cresson, the first female premier of France. We mentioned briefly decolonization, which happens after World War I and World War II. Decolonization's beginnings can be traced back to U.S. President Woodrow Wilson's plan for how to end World War I, known as the 14 Points. He believes that the countries after World War I should be able to self-determine, independence through negotiation. So this process starts in World War I. It gets picked up heavily in World War II because the United States is kind of running the table. And we talked about the Marshall Plan and all this. Independence happens in generally two ways. It's either kind of by force or by negotiation. The best example of independence through negotiation is India. Mahatma Gandhi led the Indian National Congress, which pushed for independence from Great Britain using nonviolent protest. Eventually, Great Britain negotiates with India, and agrees to give them their independence. On the flip side of that coin, it can also be done by force. A good example of that is the Algerian independence, where millions of French citizens moved to Algeria, and eventually this causes a conflict with Muslim Algerians, who started the National Liberation Front, focused on gaining Algerian independence. This threat resulted in France sending in their military and suppressing the rebellion, which resulted in years of violent rebellion, ultimately ending in France recognizing Algerians' independence. And then finally, we have changes in culture and society in the 20th and 21st century. Organized religion continues to affect the way in which people live in varying ways. We get the Second Vatican Council in modern Europe, in the modern Europe era, which is where a council of Catholic Church officials meet to focus on adapting the church to the modern world. For example, allowing priests to say mass in languages other than Latin. We get changes in art. We get, I can't pronounce, Dadaism, a response to the felt purposelessness of life after 2 world wars that had devastated the European continent. Basically, this is art that's not really art, which is kind of the point. So it's like, you know, I don't know, a drinking fountain, and we call that art, stupid stuff like that. We also get changes in architecture, right? We get a new style of architecture where function and use are the focus, not optics. So like big, boxy glass houses that are not fun to look at. We get some changes in literature. We get James Joyce creates a new style of writing called stream of consciousness, where the author writes in a style that seems like it's thoughts of the character rather than traditional dialogue. There's also a change in wealth during this time, as World War II focused hyper efficiency in industry with the creation of weapons. The production of goods greatly decreased in cost after the war industry, using its new methods of production, turned back to producing peacetime goods. So basically, we got really good at making stuff during the war out of necessity. And so when the war ends, factories are just far more efficient. And so we have as the price of goods goes down and economic prosperity increases, we're going to get the boom of the middle class. And that's eventually also going to lead to the counterculture movement, which spreads throughout Europe, pushing back against the spreading of culture, the consumerism culture and conformity and growing inequity. We get the revolutions of 1968 all across Europe and the world. College students publicly protest government abuses and inequity. And then the final thing is the baby boom, which is a massive influx in the number of people born post-World War II. So that's pretty much it, guys. We're pretty much done the content now. As a reminder, starting next week, my review sessions will be focused around the exam itself. So see you guys on the next one.